Ready to hand over the encryption keys? Colin Thorne stood in my doorway, coffee in hand, a smug smirk plastered across his 27-year-old face. 3 weeks ago, he had been a junior developer who could not debug a simple API call without searching the internet for every single step. Today, he was the lead architect of Apex Neural Systems, because his father, Bradley Thorne, was the chief executive officer, and I was supposed to report to him now. I looked at Colin, looked at the office I had worked in for 12 years, and looked at the codebase I had written from the first line to the last. It was 47 million lines of proprietary artificial intelligence that powered a $5 billion company. Then I smiled. No, Colin, I am not here to hand over anything. His smirk flickered. I am here to initiate the kill switch. The color drained from his face as he stared at me. What kill switch? I turned to my keyboard and entered a sequence that only 2 people on Earth knew existed. The one your father should have asked about, before he decided I was expendable. The screen flashed red, system override initiated. Authorization Edward Vance, original architect. Proprietary code extraction in progress. Colin dropped his coffee, the paper cup splashing dark liquid across the hardwood floor. And somewhere upstairs, Bradley Thorne's phone started ringing with calls that would never stop. Before I explain how I dismantled a $5 billion empire, line by line, you need to understand what happened next. My name is Edward Vance. I was 48 years old when Bradley Thorne decided his son deserved my life's work. 12 years earlier, I was a 36-year-old machine learning researcher with a doctorate from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a stack of rejected grant applications, and an idea that the entire academic establishment called impossible. The idea was adaptive neural architecture, artificial intelligence systems that could fundamentally restructure their own learning pathways in real time, mimicking the neuroplasticity of the human brain. Traditional artificial intelligence was static. You trained a model, deployed it, and it stayed frozen. My approach allowed artificial intelligence to continuously evolve, adapting to new data without retraining from the ground up. Every professor I pitched dismissed it. They told me it was theoretically interesting but computationally infeasible. They wrote lengthy rejection letters, stating that the resource requirements would be astronomical, and that my assumptions about real-time learning algorithms were fundamentally flawed. They told me that maybe in 20 years someone would solve it, but that it was a waste of resources today. I did not have 20 years. I had a cramped garage, a server I had built from salvaged components, and enough stubborn determination to prove them all wrong. The garage was cold in the winter, damp in the spring, and filled with the high-pitched whine of cooling fans. For 3 years, I coded alone in that garage, sleeping 4 hours a night on a dusty cot, surviving on instant noodles, cheap black coffee, and obsessive focus. By year 2, I had developed the core algorithm, what I called the Apex framework, a mathematical structure that enabled dynamic neural reconfiguration with minimal computational overhead. It worked. Not just theoretically, it actually worked. I demonstrated the prototype to myself at 3 o'clock in the morning on a rainy Tuesday, watching my system learn and adapt in ways that should have been impossible, I cried. Then, I kept coding. By year 3, I had a functional platform, rudimentary but incredibly powerful, the foundation for everything that would follow. That was when Bradley Thorne appeared in my life. Bradley was a venture capitalist who had made his fortune in enterprise software. He had heard about my work through a former colleague who had finally acknowledged what I had built in that garage. Our first meeting was at a small coffee shop in Palo Alto. Bradley was 54 then, silver-haired, dressed in a tailored suit, charismatic, the kind of man who made you feel like you were the center of the universe when he focused his attention on you. He sat across from me, sipping espresso, and told me that what I had created was extraordinary but completely unmarketable in its current form. I bristled and told him the technology spoke for itself. He smiled and said, "Technology does not speak, people do." He said I needed someone who could translate my brilliance into a language investors and customers could understand. He proposed a partnership. He would provide the business infrastructure, capital, connections, and commercial strategy. I would provide the technological vision. Together, we would build something neither of us could build alone. When I asked about the ownership structure, he suggested we divide it 50-50 as equal partners. He promised he would not pretend to understand my code, and I would not have to pretend to enjoy board meetings. We would stay in our respective lanes, trusting each other completely. It sounded reasonable, perhaps too reasonable. I thought about my cold garage, my instant noodles, and my 3 years of solitary obsession. I had already sacrificed my personal life. What was another decade if it meant proving everyone wrong? We shook hands, and Apex Neural Systems was born. The first 5 years of our partnership were exactly what Bradley had promised, a period of total consumption. We raised $23 million in Series A funding, which felt like an astronomical sum at the time. The fundraising process was exhausting. We pitched to over 30 venture capital firms in Silicon Valley, facing immense skepticism from investors who could not grasp how my real-time adaptive algorithms could scale without crashing systems. Bradley was a master salesman, translating my complex technical slides into compelling financial projections. Finally, 3 major firms agreed to co-lead the round. We hired our first team of engineers, renting a small, drafty office space in San Francisco that smelled of stale coffee and whiteboard markers. My job was to build out the Apex framework from a raw academic prototype into a robust, commercially viable enterprise platform. I worked 18-hour days, sometimes sleeping under my desk on a thin foam mat. I wrote the code, reviewed the work of our new hires, debugged complex system integrations, and documented the core architecture in obsessive detail. The technical specifications I wrote ran for thousands of pages. Bradley, meanwhile, handled everything else. He worked investor relations, secured client acquisitions, and sat through the endless business meetings that made my brain ache. The division of labor worked beautifully. By year 5, Apex Neural had grown to 200 employees and was generating $89 million in annual revenue. We had signed major contracts with several Fortune 500 companies who used our adaptive artificial intelligence for everything from real-time fraud detection to logistics and supply chain optimization. By year 8, we had expanded globally. We opened offices in London, Singapore, and Sao Paulo. Maintaining the framework across these international nodes was a massive challenge, and I spent weeks traveling to Singapore to personally resolve latency issues. Our annual revenue exceeded $400 million, and our valuation was rapidly approaching $2 billion. By year 10, Bradley convinced me that we needed to go public. The initial public offering price was set at $47 per share. I remember standing on the trading floor, surrounded by flashing screens and cheering investors, as Bradley rang the opening bell. On our opening day on the stock exchange, our market capitalization reached $3.1 billion. By year 12, Apex Neural was valued at $5.2 billion, and I was still writing code. We had 340 engineers by then. But the core architecture remained mine. The Apex framework powered every product we sold. The encryption protocols that protected our clients' sensitive data and the proprietary algorithms that our competitors spent billions trying to replicate were all systems that trace back to my original work. I believed I was irreplaceable. That was my first major mistake. Bradley's son, Colin Thorne, joined Apex Neural during our 11th year of operation. He was 26 years old at the time, fresh out of Stanford with a computer science degree. I later learned his admission to the university had been a legacy favor, not a reflection of his academic merit. He had no meaningful work experience and no demonstrated aptitude for artificial intelligence development, but he was the chief executive officer's son. Bradley walked into my office one morning and asked me to find a role for him. He suggested something in product development where Colin could learn the ropes. He told me it was important for his son to understand the family business from the ground up, though he made it clear that Colin was destined for greater things. I assigned Colin to a junior position in our client integration team. It was basic support work, helping clients connect their existing databases to our platform. He was mediocre at best. His code was sloppy, full of syntax errors and unoptimized loops, and his understanding of our system architecture was superficial. On one memorable occasion, he committed a patch to our staging environment that completely broke the database sync, delaying a major client demo by 12 hours. But Colin possessed the absolute confidence of someone who had never been told no in his entire life, combined with the competence of someone who had never needed to try. The other senior engineers on the team noticed this immediately. They grew increasingly frustrated with having to clean up his mistakes, while Colin took the credit in front of the business managers. I documented his performance issues, provided written feedback, and tried to assign senior mentors to help him improve. None of it worked. Colin did not want to learn or improve. He wanted to arrive at the top without walking the path. By month 6, he was complaining to his father about his limited role in the company. By month 9, he began attending executive strategy meetings that he had not been invited to, sitting at the back of the room with a notebook and a confident grin, acting as if he already belonged there. By month 11, he was positioning himself as the heir apparent to a technical throne he did not understand. And Bradley listened to him. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning without any prior warning or discussion. It was a company-wide email with the subject line of Leadership Evolution. The email stated that as we prepared for Apex Neural's next phase of global growth, the company was restructuring its technical leadership. Colin Thorne would assume the role of lead architect, overseeing all core platform development. I, Edward Vance, would transition to a strategic advisory capacity, supporting Colin's vision for our technical future. I read the email 3 times, unable to process the words. Strategic advisory capacity. After 12 years of building every critical system in the company from nothing, I was being sidelined for a young man who could not explain our basic architecture without reading from a cheat sheet. I walked into Bradley's office without knocking, closing the door firmly behind me. He looked up from his sleek laptop, his expression maintaining the careful neutrality of a seasoned executive who had anticipated this very confrontation. I demanded that he explain the email. Bradley sighed, leaned back in his leather chair, and said that he understood this was surprising to me. Surprising? I asked, raising my voice. You are replacing me with your son, your incompetent, unqualified son who cannot build a basic database query. Bradley raised his hands in a placating gesture, telling me that he was not replacing me, but rather evolving my role. He said that I had been in the technical trenches for 12 long years and that it was time to step back and let new leadership take the wheel. I scoffed at the term new leadership, pointing out that Colin could not debug a simple memory leak without senior supervision, and that just last week he committed a broken patch that crashed our staging environment for 6 hours, halting all testing. Bradley remained calm, saying that Colin was learning and that I would help him learn. I stopped, staring at my co-founder as the truth finally clicked in my mind. I realized what he actually wanted. He wanted me to train his son, transfer my entire decade of specialized knowledge, and make Colin appear competent while I faded into the background. Bradley's silence was all the confirmation I needed. I told him that once Colin was ready and could stand on his own, he would push me out entirely with a nice early retirement story, a generous severance package, and a press release about the founder stepping aside for fresh perspectives. Bradley claimed that was not the case, but I knew it was exactly what he had planned. I turned toward the office door, telling him this was not over. Bradley told me that actually it was over, as the board of directors had approved the restructuring that very morning, making it official. I paused at the threshold, turned back, and told him he should have read our original employment and partnership agreement more carefully. When he asked what I was talking about, I simply walked out. That night, I went home and spent hours searching through my personal filing cabinets. I retrieved a document I had not looked at in 12 years, the original partnership agreement between Bradley Thorne and Edward Vance. We had drafted it ourselves during those early coffee shop meetings in Palo Alto, long before expensive corporate lawyers got involved, before the company became valuable enough for anyone to care about fine print. I turned to Section 12, which detailed the intellectual property provisions. The clause stated that all proprietary code, algorithms, and technical architectures developed by either partner would remain the individual intellectual property of the creating partner, licensed exclusively to Apex Neural Systems for the duration of the partnership. It further stated that should either partner's role be materially diminished without written consent, the affected partner retained the right to revoke the license with 90 days written notice. I read those words 5 times under the dim light of my desk lamp. Section 12, paragraph 4, explicitly defined material diminution to include, but not be limited to, a reduction in title, removal from technical decision-making authority, or subordination to personnel with less seniority or technical expertise. My role had definitely been materially diminished. The Apex framework and every single line of our foundational code belonged to me. It was licensed to the company, not owned by it. I picked up my phone and called my personal attorney, Clara Lawson, at 11 o'clock that night. Clara had handled all of my personal legal matters since Apex's Series B funding round. She was brilliant, meticulous, and exactly the ally I needed. When she answered, I told her they were pushing me out. I explained that Bradley had promoted his son to lead architect and demoted me to an advisory role. When I mentioned the board approval, Clara asked if I had any recourse. I told her about the original partnership agreement and the Section 12 intellectual property clause. There was a long, heavy silence on the line as Clara processed the information. She recalled drafting the subsequent revisions for our later funding rounds, but noted that the original agreement was signed before Apex was formally incorporated, before the initial public offering, and before any corporate restructuring. My heart sank, and I asked if that meant it was worthless. Clara replied that she did not say that, explaining that the original agreement was never formally superseded or replaced by the board, meaning the intellectual property provisions were never explicitly voided. She explained that the company had been operating under that exact license for 12 years. If the license was indeed revocable, then I had the legal right to revoke it. However, she warned me that the practical implications would be catastrophic, as pulling the foundational architecture from a $5 billion public company would trigger an enormous legal battle. I told Clara that I did not want an expensive, drawn-out legal battle, but rather the leverage to take back what was rightfully mine. She agreed that if we played our cards right, we had a strong hand under Section 106 of Title 17 of the United States Code, which protects a creator's exclusive rights. I realized I had exactly 90 days before my advisory role officially began, which gave me 90 days to prepare my strategy. During those 90 days of preparation, I did not waste a single hour. First, I set out to document every single foundational system I had built since the company's inception. I cataloged the core algorithms, the adaptive learning protocols, the complex encryption architecture, and the neural pathway optimization systems. I spent late nights analyzing our repository, mapping out dependencies, and tracing every module back to my initial code. I analyzed the data ingestion pipeline, the feedback loop systems, and the multi-threaded caching layer. The final tally was staggering. I discovered that 47,283,691 lines of code, representing roughly 63% of Apex Neural's entire codebase, had been authored directly by me. Without my contributions, the platform would collapse into an unusable heap of errors. The interconnections were too deep, and the database dependencies were too fundamental to be separated by novice programmers. Second, I quietly identified allies within our ranks. Not everyone at Apex was loyal to Bradley, and many senior engineers had watched Colin's rapid promotion with growing frustration and alarm. I held discreet, off-site conversations with key developers, department heads, and even a few sympathetic board members who questioned whether family favoritism was a sound business strategy for a publicly traded company. Our senior database administrator, who had been with us for 6 years, confessed to me over coffee that he was terrified the company would go under if Colin remained in charge. He told me that Colin had tried to push a rewrite of our database schema that ignored basic indexing principles, which would have slowed queries to a crawl. The lead security architect also expressed deep concern, noting that Colin had suggested using an unverified open-source library for our core encryption, ignoring major known security vulnerabilities. I built a strong, quiet network of professionals who promised to stand by me when the conflict came to a head. Third, I modified the code extraction tool. This was not a malicious virus or a destructive script, which would have been illegal and unethical. Instead, it was an elegant proprietary extraction utility that I had built into the architecture years ago as a safeguard in case the company was ever hostily acquired by a competitor who might misuse the technology. The utility was designed to identify, tag, and isolate every line of code I had authored, preparing it for formal reclamation. If I triggered it, it would not delete anything, but it would separate my licensed assets from the company's proprietary code, rendering Apex's systems non-functional. By day 87 of the transition period, Colin had been acting as lead architect for nearly 3 months. The results were exactly as disastrous as I had predicted. The company had suffered 2 major database crashes that disrupted services for hours, a severe security vulnerability that almost exposed customer records, and a botched deployment that required an emergency rollback. The deployment failure occurred because Colin attempted to refactor the asynchronous task scheduler without understanding how thread locks were managed in the core framework. The engineering department was in disarray, and several of our top developers had already resigned in protest. The board of directors was panic-stricken. Our stock price had dropped by 11%, and clients were asking difficult questions. Bradley was desperately searching for scapegoats. It was in this tense atmosphere that Colin entered my office on day 87. He stood there with that arrogant smirk, holding a cup of coffee. He asked if I was ready to hand over the encryption keys. The encryption architecture was the one system he could not access without my personal administrative credentials. Without those keys, he could not manage client data security, meaning he could not pretend to be the lead architect. I looked at him, feeling a calm certainty. I told him that I was not here to hand over anything, but rather to initiate the extraction utility. Colin's smile vanished. "What extraction?" he asked. I turned to my terminal and entered a sequence that only I knew. I told him it was the safeguard his father should have inquired about before deciding I was expendable. The screen flashed red, indicating that the system override was initiated and the proprietary code extraction was in progress. Colin dropped his coffee, the paper cups spilling across the floor. The terminal display showed 47,283,691 lines of code flagged and ready. The screen clearly displayed that 63.2% of the total codebase and 100% of the core architecture were marked for removal. Colin stared in horror, stammering that this was company property. I told him that it was my intellectual property, licensed to the company under Section 12, a license I was fully prepared to revoke. I told him to get his father immediately. Bradley arrived in my office exactly 11 minutes later, his face flushed and his tie askew, having been pulled from an urgent board meeting. He demanded to know what on earth I was doing, his voice trembling with anger. He slammed his hand on my desk, looking down at the terminal screen where the red warning text was still flashing. Colin was pointing at the screen, his hand shaking, trying to explain what he had just seen, while I sat back in my chair and watched them realize their mistake. I pointed to the terminal screen and calmly told Bradley that we were looking at my original partnership agreement, the very document he should have reviewed before attempting to demote me. I explained that Section 12 clearly stated that all proprietary code and architecture remained my personal intellectual property and was licensed exclusively to Apex Neural Systems. I added that the license was revocable upon any material diminution of my role. Bradley's face went from red to pale gray. He stammered that the agreement was 12 years old and that I could not possibly be serious. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I was completely serious and that I would revoke the license unless we renegotiated our partnership immediately. When he asked what my terms were, I handed him a folder containing a newly drafted agreement. Bradley read the document slowly, his hands beginning to tremble by the 3rd page. He looked up, his voice cracking as he asked if I was demanding control of the company. I told him that I wanted what I had built, no more and no less. I demanded 51.3% ownership of the company. Bradley yelled that the board of directors would never approve such outrageous terms. I calmly explained that the board would approve whatever was necessary to prevent a $5 billion company from becoming completely worthless overnight. I told him he would have to explain to them what happens when I revoke my intellectual property license, and how long it would take their remaining engineers to rebuild the core architecture from scratch, assuming they even could. Bradley looked at his son, then back at me. He asked what would happen to Colin. I told him that Colin would return to a position that actually matched his current level of experience. He would become a junior developer with a dedicated senior mentor who could actually teach him what he should have learned before being handed a title he did not earn. Colin tried to protest, claiming it was humiliating, but I told him it was simply realistic. I told him he was not a lead architect and that he was barely a competent programmer, which was not an insult, but a factual assessment. I explained that if he wanted to lead teams one day, he needed to actually understand the technology first. I turned back to Bradley, telling him these terms were not a punishment, but a correction. I told him he had tried to erase my contributions and hand my life's work to his son, and that I was simply restoring the proper order. When he asked what would happen if he refused, I reached for my keyboard and told him I would initiate the full extraction process, which would disable their platform within hours and render their stock worthless within days. Bradley stared at me, and for the first time in 12 years, I saw real respect in his eyes. He told me he needed to speak with the board. I gave him 24 hours. The board of directors approved my terms in 16 hours. Clara presented our solid legal analysis under Section 106 of Title 17 of the United States Code, demonstrating to the board that the original licensing agreement remained valid and had never been superseded by any subsequent corporate bylaws. The board members, representing the major institutional investors, immediately realized they had no choice. If they went to court, my injunction would freeze the software, causing the stock to crash. The restructuring was announced 3 weeks later. I assumed the role of executive chairman with a majority ownership stake of 51.3%. Bradley transitioned to a non-executive board advisor role. His ownership reduced to 18.7%. Colin was reassigned to the entry-level engineering development program, where he was paired with a tough, experienced mentor who gave him no special treatment. The press coverage was extensive, praising my return, and our stock price jumped by 14% on the day of the announcement. During my first board meeting as chairman, I sat at the head of a long mahogany table that I had never been invited to occupy before. I looked at the faces of the directors who had approved my demotion just a few months earlier, and I made it clear that the company was built on technical excellence, that promotions would be based entirely on merit, and that nepotism would no longer be tolerated under any circumstances. 18 months have passed since that day. Apex Neural is thriving. Our annual revenue has grown by 37%, and we have filed 43 new patents. Colin completed the engineering development program and has earned a legitimate promotion to junior architect. He spent months working long hours, learning to write clean code, and admitting when he did not know the answer. He is not a genius, but he has improved and is much more humble. We had coffee recently, and he sincerely apologized for his past behavior, which I accepted. Bradley resigned from the board 6 months ago, and we no longer speak. In my office, I keep a framed screenshot of the extraction tool showing the 47 million lines of code ready for reclamation. It serves as a daily reminder that my value does not depend on someone else's approval, and that the work we do ultimately belongs to the creator. You cannot erase the architect. You can only forget how much you need them, and sometimes you have to be willing to burn everything down to remind them.